The failure of the Jedi Council is a tale woven into the very fabric of the galaxy's downfall, a slow and tragic descent marked by hubris, dogma, and an inability to adapt to the shifting tides of reality. Once seen as the paragons of peace and justice, the Jedi Council's collapse became inevitable not through a single catastrophic decision, but rather through a series of missteps rooted in their own misguided beliefs. At the heart of their failure was an over-reliance on tradition and a rigid adherence to an inflexible code. The Jedi prided themselves on detachment, preaching that emotions like love and anger would cloud their judgment and lead them down the dark path. Yet this detachment made them blind to the emotional and political currents that swirled around them. They viewed the galaxy as a simple dichotomy, the light side and the dark side, good versus evil. But the galaxy is far more complex than that binary perspective allowed, and in their refusal to see the gray areas, they became vulnerable to manipulation. Their physical presence, perched atop the gleaming spires of Coruscant, symbolized their distance from the everyday struggles of the galaxy's denizens. From this ivory tower, the Jedi proclaimed themselves guardians of peace, yet they had little understanding of the suffering and fear that plagued the common people. The Sith, cunning and patient, exploited this blind spot masterfully. Palpatine, in his guise as the benevolent Chancellor, positioned himself as the champion of the underrepresented, the downtrodden, and those disillusioned by a republic bloated with bureaucracy and corruption. The Jedi Council failed to recognize Palpatine as a threat, even as his power grew unchecked. They relied heavily on the Force to guide them, believing that it would provide clarity in moments of uncertainty. However, the dark side, clouding everything, dulled their perception. They were so entrenched in their beliefs about how the Force operated that they failed to see how it could be manipulated against them. When the Sith orchestrated the Clone Wars, the Jedi were drawn into a conflict that contradicted their very principles. They became generals and warriors in a galactic war, abandoning their role as peacekeepers and succumbing to the lure of power under the guise of duty. This militarization was not just a tactical error, but a moral one. By leading armies and engaging in warfare, the Jedi lost their moral high ground and further distanced themselves from the ideals they were meant to uphold. They justified these actions as necessary, believing that they alone could safeguard the Republic from the Separatists. Yet in doing so, they allowed themselves to become pawns in Palpatine's grand scheme. Every battle fought and every life lost only strengthened the Chancellor's grip on power, further eroding the values the Jedi claimed to defend. The Jedi's failure was also deeply personal. Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one prophesied to bring balance to the Force, was a product of their inability to adapt. From the moment Anakin entered the Jedi Order, he was treated as an outsider. The Council, wary of his potential and consumed by fear of his attachment to his mother, refused to grant him the guidance and trust he so desperately needed. They failed to see that their rigid teachings would drive him toward the very thing they feared, the dark side. Anakin's fall was not solely the result of his personal flaws, but also of the Council's inability to provide him with a framework for navigating his emotions. The Jedi saw attachment as inherently dangerous, yet they offered no viable alternative for someone like Anakin, who was burdened by love, fear, and loss. Instead of nurturing his potential and helping him reconcile his emotions, they marginalized him, feeding his resentment and isolation. Palpatine, ever the opportunist, stepped into this void, offering Anakin the validation and understanding he craved. The Council's distrust of Anakin culminated in a critical moment when they denied him the rank of Master, despite his evident skill and contributions during the war. This decision, born out of fear and suspicion, was a fatal miscalculation. It not only humiliated Anakin, but also further eroded his loyalty to the Jedi. In seeking to control him, they pushed him closer to the Sith, where he found not only power but also the promise of saving those he loved, a promise the Jedi could not or would not make. Moreover, the Jedi's political naivety played a crucial role in their downfall. The Jedi believed themselves to be above politics, yet they were deeply entangled in the Republic's political machinery. This contradiction made them vulnerable to exploitation. As Palpatine amassed emergency powers under the guise of protecting the Republic, the Jedi stood by, unwilling or unable to challenge him effectively. They suspected him of dark intentions, but lacked the courage or foresight to act decisively. By the time the Council resolved to confront Palpatine, it was too late. Their attempt to arrest him was not only doomed to fail but also played directly into his narrative of a Jedi coup. The galaxy, already disillusioned by the prolonged war and the Jedi's perceived elitism, was primed to accept Palpatine's version of events. When Order 66 was executed, the galaxy did not rise in defense of the Jedi. Instead, the once revered guardians of peace were hunted down and exterminated with little resistance from the populace they had sworn to protect. The tragedy of the Jedi Council lies in their inability to evolve. They clung to outdated doctrines, failed to read the shifting political landscape, and underestimated their adversaries. They believed that their wisdom and connection to the Force would be enough to guide them, yet this overconfidence blinded them to their own vulnerabilities. In their failure, the galaxy was plunged into darkness, and the very ideals they sought to uphold were lost to tyranny. Their downfall serves as a cautionary tale of how even the most noble institutions can collapse when they lose sight of their purpose and refuse to adapt to change. The Jedi's greatest strength, their connection to the Force, became their greatest weakness when it was coupled with an inflexible mindset. Their story is not just one of betrayal and defeat, but of a tragic inability to understand the world they sought to protect. The failure of the Jedi Council was not simply a collapse of an institution, it was a collapse of vision, a decay of wisdom into dogma. The tragedy is compounded by their refusal to embrace the very change that could have preserved their legacy. Even as the galaxy shifted around them, they remained steadfast in their belief that their ancient traditions and teachings were immutable. This blindness to evolution was as fatal as any lightsaber stroke. Their relationship with the Republic was emblematic of this stagnation. The Jedi Order and the Republic had existed in a symbiotic relationship for millennia, but over time that relationship became toxic. The Jedi saw themselves as the Republic's protectors, but they failed to recognize that the Republic they served was no longer the noble institution it once was. Corruption had seeped into every level of governance, and the Republic had become an engine of inequality and exploitation. The Council ignored these signs, believing that their mission to uphold the Republic's laws was inherently just, even when those laws perpetuated injustice. This uncritical loyalty was a fatal flaw. The Jedi could not conceive of a reality where the Republic itself might be the problem. This was a blindness Palpatine exploited masterfully. He painted the Jedi as self-righteous enforcers of a corrupt system, a narrative that resonated with many across the galaxy. As the Republic faltered, the Jedi became its most visible symbol of continuity, and thus its failures became theirs. They were seen not as saviors but as enablers of the status quo, guardians of a crumbling regime that no longer served its people. Their detachment from the galaxy's political and social realities also meant that they were ill-prepared to deal with the Sith's return. The Jedi believed they had eradicated the Sith a millennium earlier, and this belief bred complacency. When evidence of the Sith's resurgence first emerged, the Council was slow to act, reluctant to admit that their ancient enemies had returned under their very noses. Even when they finally acknowledged the threat, they underestimated its scope. They viewed the Sith as merely a rival faction within the Force, rather than understanding them as master manipulators capable of bending entire systems to their will. This lack of foresight was evident in their dealings with Count Dooku, the former Jedi turned leader of the separatist movement. Dooku's defection should have been a wake-up call, a sign that the Jedi Order's rigid structure and philosophies were failing to address the needs and concerns of its members. Instead, the Council dismissed him as a lost cause, a solitary anomaly, rather than a symptom of deeper issues within their ranks. They failed to recognize that Dooku's disillusionment was not unique, it was shared by many who had grown tired of the Republic's decay and the Jedi's complicity. Dooku's alliance with the Sith and his role in the Clone Wars were direct results of the Jedi's inability to engage with dissenting voices. The Council's refusal to question its own practices or to consider alternative perspectives created a breeding ground for resentment and betrayal. This insularity was mirrored in their treatment of Anakin Skywalker, whose growing discontent and inner conflict were similarly dismissed. The Council's response to Anakin's struggles was to impose stricter discipline rather than offering genuine understanding or support. Anakin was a living embodiment of the Council's contradictions. He was the chosen one, a figure of immense power and potential, yet he was never fully trusted. His emotional volatility was seen as a weakness rather than a natural aspect of his humanity that could be guided and harnessed. The Council's rigid adherence to their code meant that they could not reconcile Anakin's unique nature with their expectations of what a Jedi should be. They sought to mold him into their image rather than allowing him to grow into his destiny. This failure to nurture Anakin's potential was mirrored in their approach to the Force itself. The Jedi viewed the Force as a tool to be mastered, a source of guidance and power that was to be used in service of their ideals. But in their pursuit of control, they lost sight of the deeper truths the Force might reveal. The Sith, by contrast, embraced the Force in its entirety, including the chaos and passion the Jedi sought to suppress. This holistic approach gave the Sith an advantage, allowing them to manipulate the Force in ways the Jedi could not anticipate or counter. When the final confrontation with Palpatine arrived, the Jedi were unprepared for the scope of his power. Their attempt to arrest him was a desperate, clumsy effort that only served to confirm his narrative of a Jedi conspiracy. Mace Windu's decision to attempt to execute Palpatine, rather than bringing him to trial, was a stark departure from the Jedi's principles, highlighting the extent to which the Council had lost its moral compass. In that moment, the line between Jedi and Sith blurred, and Anakin's choice to intervene was as much a reaction to the Council's hypocrisy as it was to his own fears and desires. Order 66 was the culmination of the Jedi's failures. The clones, whom the Jedi had come to trust as comrades in arms, turned on them without hesitation. This betrayal was not simply a military defeat, it was a profound indictment of the Jedi's inability to inspire true loyalty and trust. The clones had been conditioned to obey Palpatine's orders, but the speed and efficiency with which they executed the Jedi reflected the extent to which the Order had become isolated and alienated from those they fought alongside. The galaxy's response to the Jedi's downfall was one of apathy, if not outright approval. By the time the Jedi were purged, they were no longer seen as heroes. The public, weary of war and disillusioned by the Republic's failures, accepted Palpatine's narrative of the Jedi as power-hungry traitors. The Order, which had once been a beacon of hope, had become an institution that few were willing to mourn. In the end, the Jedi Council's failure was a failure of vision, adaptability, and humility. They clung to an outdated understanding of the galaxy and their place within it, refusing to see that the world had changed. Their insistence on detachment and their rigid adherence to tradition blinded them to the needs and struggles of those they claimed to serve. They placed their faith in prophecy and the Force, yet they failed to recognize the signs of their own impending doom. The story of the Jedi Council is a tragedy, not just because of their fall, but because of the lost potential. They were an order capable of great good, but their refusal to adapt doomed them to irrelevance and destruction. In their failure, the galaxy was plunged into an era of darkness, and the hope they once embodied was extinguished,